Hello, my name is Jim Ferran, and I'm really pleased to have been asked to talk a wee bit about how I use an airbrush to put colour and finishes onto some of my wood turnings. Um, I got into using the airbrush and colouring my turnings after looking at the work of people like Nick Agar, Stuart Farini, people of that sort online. And there are loads of YouTube videos out there that'll give you piles of ideas, all kinds of ideas about how you can texture and colour wood. So I'd recommend, particularly looking at Stuart Farini, and he's done a wee series in the Wood Turner magazine over the last few months that I found very good as well. I thought the best place to start was to talk a wee bit about equipment, and to start maybe with airbrushes themselves. And there are three main types. The first type is the very basic type, which is really a little spray gun. You can buy them for about 50 quid. They normally come with a tank of compressed air, and you have very little control with them. You can't really control the spread of the spray, the air pressure, or anything else really with them. The common makes would be Humbrol and Revell. Personally, I would steer clear of them. Then there are the type of airbrush that I use, and this is a gravity feed airbrush. The liquid that they're going to spray is inserted into this wee cup here, and comes out through the nozzle. I personally prefer this type of airbrush, but it is a personal preference. The reason that I like this one is that I'm inclined to work with very small amounts of liquids, of fluids, paints, and so forth. So I can put 2 or 3 droplets in at a time, use them, flush them through, and add the next colour, and work on like that. However, the other type of main type of airbrush that you can get your hands on is a suction feed airbrush. Now, a suction feed airbrush looks like this, except that it has a little nozzle that comes off the side here and that goes into a bottle. Now, the benefit of that is that if you are using a lot of paint, you can fill the number of bottles and you just swap the bottles around according to what you're doing. I can't justify that because it'll eventually coagulate, the paint will go to waste, and I would rather not have that. I prefer to just work with the small amounts that I'm going to be using. The guys who do like detailing on cars, painted motorcycle helmets, that kind of thing, would very often use the suction feed type airbrush. Because they're using a fair amount of liquid and they're probably doing a number of large items at any given time. But for me, personally, this is the type that I would go for. Just to complicate things a wee bit further, there are two actions, if you like, with an airbrush. You can buy a single action airbrush, and a single action airbrush is one where whenever you press the button down, it releases the air plus the liquid, and you have very little control of the amount of liquid that's going to come out of the brush at any given time. This brush is what's called a double action airbrush, and to use this, I'll just plug it in to give you an idea. To use this, you press down to get air. You can barely hear it there because I have it at quite low pressure. But press down to get air and then pull back. And the more you pull back, the more liquid you release. So down for air and pulling back to release the liquid. That gives you an awful lot of control. You can get down to very fine lines, or if you pull back, you can release quite a lot of liquid in a go. It does take a wee bit of work and a wee bit of practice to get used to. But this, for me, the double action airbrush is the way to go. It gives you most control over what you're trying to do. So each airbrush as well, with your airbrush, one of the ways that you can control the amount of liquid that you're spraying at any given point is to vary the size of the needle in the brush. Now the needle goes through the back of the brush here. Let's take this one out to give you a look. To a very fine point. And the point, the size of the point really helps to define, along with the nozzle here, the nozzle and the needle are matched, and the size of the point is what helps to define the amount of fluid that you're allowing out. A lot of airbrushes, when you buy them, will come with a needle of 0.1, 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, variations in the size of the needle. I generally work with a 0.4, that's a 0.4 that's in there at the moment, with a matched nozzle, or a 0.2 if I'm doing very fine small work, but that would be quite rare. So I mean, my basic kit for working with is gravity feed, double action with a 0.4 needle in it, and that covers just about anything that I would want to do with the airbrush. Other bits and pieces of kit are the compressor, small compressor with a little tank. You have good control over the pressure in that. Excellent little compressor, and you can buy kits from a number of companies in England who'd sell you an airbrush and compressor kit, probably starting at about 150 quid for a decent setup to get going, and depending on the quality and so on of the airbrush that you want. Other bits and pieces then that are worth thinking about are I have a wee holder that just clamps to the table, and that's where I rest the airbrush. Well worth having. There's also a pot that you buy that whenever you come to the end of a piece of work and you're flushing your airbrush through, you flush it into that little pot, and that helps to stop vapors and so on from going around the place. Depending on what I'm actually spraying with, I might use I have a little portable spray booth that my good wife bought me a few years back as a Christmas present. I think probably more to save the kitchen table than anything else, but an excellent little thing. I won't be using that for this demo because you wouldn't be able to see if it was working inside the wee booth. But it's just a box basically with an extractor fan on the back of it, and I just set it up in the kitchen table, run a pipe outside out the back of the house here. As far as colours and so on are concerned, there are a number of things that you can do. One is to use inks. There's an example there, Liquitex ink, and I have a number of those, and they work pretty well on wood. You know, they're really used for graphic design work, but I've used them on wood quite a bit. They flow very well. They're perfect for putting through an airbrush. They don't clog or anything else, provided you've kept the brush clean and you've made sure you're not getting dust and so on into your inks. And that's one of the things that we really need to talk a wee bit about, is dust. Biggest enemy you have, because you're working with needles that are very, very small, the biggest enemy you have is dust. And that you're spraying, you'll start getting blockages, or the paint or the colour just spattering rather than getting so cleanliness is really important. So sometimes I'll use those inks. Another thing that I use are airbrush paints. Model makers to use in airbrushes, but they do a lot of different kits. There's a set of sort of primary colours that come in, and they're pre-mixed, they're thinned down, They are ideal for using through the airbrush. You're not mucking about with thinners and all the rest of it. And very, very rarely will you get a blockage or a problem with them. So, I mean, as I say, I've just shown you there the primary colour set. That's a set of metallics. You know, you've golds and bronzes and copper finishes and all sorts in there. And I would use those fairly readily as well. And they're excellent. They're acrylic based. So you need to seal your wood before you put those on. The inks are also acrylic, but I would use those first and then seal over the top of them. Use the paints, the wood just soaks them up. The inks seem to colour better without putting without putting your satin sealer on first. But for the demo purposes, what I'm going to be using are water-based dyes, and I use these intrinsic colours. Any of you that sort of watch YouTube videos, you've probably come across Martin Savant-Smith. That's the guy who developed the Hampshire Sheen waxes and so forth, and he also developed these intrinsic colours. There's a whole range of, I think there's about 12 of them. I have a box of 9 or 10 that I bought as a sample set 18 months ago, and you know, that'd probably do me for another 18 months, and I use them fairly heavily. You get a set for around about, I think it's about 40 quid or so. They're water based, they're obviously diluted and so forth. So a bit like the inks, they'll go straight into your brush, work through, do whatever you need to do. Very, very rarely get a clog or anything else with them. I find them excellent, and there's a good colour range. The Hampshire Sheen website also has sort of colour wheels and suggestions for how to mix them, and demonstration videos and all kinds of stuff that'll help you along with that. Other wee bits and pieces that I would find helpful, wee pipettes. You buy those for a couple of dozen for a couple of pounds on the likes of eBay or Amazon, and I use those just to dunk in, take a wee drop of stuff that I'm going to use and put them into the wee cup in the airbrush. It works very well. If you're going to be using paints, you may well need thinner, airbrush thinner, and at the end of the day, whenever you're cleaning up, airbrush cleaner, you know, you put some of that through your airbrush into your wee pot, and that'll take away most of the remains of what you've been working with. I'm inclined at the end of the day to strip the airbrush right down and then use some of that just on a wee lint-free cloth to clean the needle and so forth, and then just flush some through the nozzle to make sure that it's kept clean. But useful stuff to have. And again, I think a bottle of that's about 6 or 7 quid, but I get 6 months easily out of that, and I'm a fairly heavy user. If you are using paints, again, there's a thing you can get called flow improver. So you put your paint and your thinner together, put it into your gravity feed cup. 1 drop, 2 drops of that, and just helps it to flow through, and helps to keep the inside of the airbrush clean. But it's not a thing that I would use very often, because I mostly use water-based stuff. But on the rare occasions that I do use paint, a wee drop of that really does help. Okay, what else? Yes, a thing that I've found handy over time is stencils, and I would buy sort of just oddly shaped things, you know. I mean, that's like sort of a snakeskin almost effect coming through on that. That's one that's all just wee sort of random holes and bits and pieces, little circles and so on. And I use those quite a bit, sort of build up a sense of texture and so on. I use it really randomly, but they're all kind of abstract shapes that I would use on a random basis just to get finishes, such as on the Autumn Colours finish, for example. And I'll put a wee picture of that up just to show you what I'm talking about there. So, and when it comes down then to what you're going to paint on, for the demo I'm going to use this. It's a piece of sycamore that I've turned, and we'll colour this surface here. I have put a bit of masking tape on it because we're only going to be colouring the top surface on it, and then taking the centre out later on. I sand these down to about 320, sometimes up to 400, depending on the wood itself. But this is pretty good. So that's been sanded down to 320. Cleaned really thoroughly with meths, and no sanding sealer put on it, because I'm going to use the water-based dyes, the intrinsic colour dyes. By the way, there are other dyes that you can use. Chestnut do a really nice set of like alcohol-based dyes as well, and they do a little miniature tester set as well of colours that you'll get quite a bit out of actually putting them through an airbrush. So that's what I'm going to colour. I put the dyes on, and then give it 2 or 3 coats of sanding sealer, and then generally I'll finish it off with a hard wax finish using the Chestnut 3 mop system. But again, you don't have to do that. You could spray a lacquer over it, or just give it 2 or 3 coats of microcrystalline wax. And I use microcrystalline or the hard wax finish simply because you find that whenever you put the colour on the wood, people want to handle it even more than they normally do whenever they pick up a wooden bowl. So next stage is I'll come back to you and we'll actually colour this. Okay, so I've everything set up, and I'm now going to just start colouring. And I'm starting off with a ruby colour. Just check the flow. Okay, obviously that was the compressor kicking in there. Sorry about that noise in the background. So I've put on enough of the ruby, I think. Just going to flush through the remains of it. I'm working at about 25, 27 psi, by the way, on the compressor. Find that to be just about right for what I'm trying to do here. As you can see, there's no sort of sense or pattern to what I'm doing. I used to make model aircraft, and basically this is camouflage type shapes that you might see on the wings of a wee model Spitfire or something like that. So it's those kinds of shapes that I use and just gradually build up colour and fill in the gaps. Okay, now moving on, going to add some plum. It continues with sort of the red theme, but adds a wee bit of body and darkness. And begins to introduce blue, because I will be using 2 shades of blue later on. You'll notice that the dye is going on in very light coats. If you spray too hard, you end up with blotches and spots and all sorts. So better to take your time and just build it up with fine lines. Sorry. So we can see what I'm doing here. Okay, so far I've put on our darkest colour, which is the plum, and one of the sort of mid-range colours, which is that ruby. Now I'm going to put on the lightest colour that I'm going to use, and that having those 3 sort of registers on the surface will allow me then to work the other colours in. And this is called honey. Okay, back now to another dark colour. This time it's a midnight blue, I won't be using an awful lot of this. It's just again to add a wee bit of depth and a wee bit of texture. I'm now going to add a wee bit of burnt orange, and I'll use it between the darker colours to try to lift them a wee bit and give a bit of contrast. So between the plum and the blue here, for example. Now another blue, this time it's what Hamster Scene describe as sky blue, but I think if you were buying it now they've tweaked it and have changed the name. I'm not sure what they're calling it now, but I don't think it's still known as sky blue in their collection. So okay, giving it a wee bit of time to dry, and I'm now going to give it a light, very light, fine mist of the honey colour. And that's all it needs, very fine light mist, and that, I don't know how well that's translating onto the screen for you, but to my eye that has really muted down a wee bit of the power in the colours. It has strengthened some other colours. It has helped to give a wee bit of unity to it. There's a hint of green now starting to come out in some of the blues, and to me it looks really quite psychedelic. It's nice. When I do this particular combination of colours, it always reminds me of like lava lamps and things like that, so I'm inclined to call this a psychedelic pattern. Next step is let that dry. I'll then take it out into the shed, give it a couple of coats of cellulose sanding sealer, cut it back a wee bit, and then I'll do it up with the polishing mops. So the next time you see it, I'll turn the center out of it and you'll see the finished article. So here we go, that's the finished article. It's had 3 coats of cellulose sanding sealer, and then put a couple of coats of Carnauba put on with the buffing mop. It didn't go through the 3 stages that the chestnut system generally would, because I didn't want to be taking the risk of beginning to take the colour off. Some of the colour has gone slightly, and it's muted it down a wee bit, but that's fine. So it's just had sanding sealer, which has been knocked back slightly, and then let's say 2 or 3 coats of Carnauba wax. There it is. Okay, so I hope that you found that helpful, and I hope that maybe some of you will give it a go for yourselves. I say there is all the kit and all involved, and it can be fairly expensive to start, but I've found it very rewarding and good fun to do, and the results I think speak for themselves. And I'd reiterate again that your biggest enemy in working with this stuff is dust and dirt. You know, if you get dust and dirt into your airbrush, you've ruined your work. You need to strip the whole airbrush down, thoroughly clean it, and start again. So although you'll see people like Stuart Farini working with airbrushes in their sheds and in their workshops, I tried it in the early stages and there was no way, although I have a reasonably good dust extraction system and so on, there was just no way that I could keep the dust down to a level where it would allow me to work without interruption due to dirt getting into the system. So that's why I work now just at my kitchen table. Keep the kit clean and you'll get good results. So I'll put up a couple of photographs of some other bits and pieces that I've done with airbrushing, and some explanations, and that's me finished. Thanks very much for your attention.